Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Rodean. I am ESCA's Director of Education and Events, and thank you all so much for joining us today for the second Leadership Lab powered by ESCA's Rising Leaders Committee. This webinar series was created to help rising leaders and industry members grow and succeed in their role. And I am so excited because today I am joined by Tommy Goodwin, who is the Executive Vice President of ECA, otherwise known as the Exhibitions and Conference Alliance. ECA is the Advocacy Association for the business events industry. And in this role, Tommy leads ECA's work on behalf of the interconnected ecosystem of exhibitors, event and meeting organizers, suppliers, venues, and destinations that comprise the global business events landscape. Prior to joining ECA, Tommy spent more than 20 years working for several globally recognized associations and corporations, including Oracle, AARP, and the Project Management Institute. So it's safe to say that Tommy is very knowledgeable on the events, business, and political landscape. So with that, here is Tommy Goodwin and A Tale of Two Politics, an advocacy update from ECA.
Very much. Thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity to be with all of you today. I'm thrilled to be able to tell you a little bit about what's happening in Washington, D.C., because I know it's been in the headlines so much over the last year or so. We want to give you the most up-to-date information that you and your organizations need to be successful. And as Rachel mentioned, the title of today's session is A Tale of Two Politics, and I'm almost tempted to go full Dickens here and start with it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. But I have to admit, it does sort of feel that way sometimes. This has been such a very busy and very chaotic year in Washington, D.C., and it has affected the industry in innumerable ways. Some of them very good, some of them much more challenging. And I struggle when folks reach out and say, okay, well, what's the story in Washington, D.C., right? What's happening? What is the narrative? What's the overarching theme that as I'm looking through this lens, when I see things on television or online, how do I make out what's happening in Washington, D.C.? And I've come to the conclusion as we sit about, 10 months and one day into the new term of President Trump, I don't think there's a single story. I think there's two. I think they're two very different stories. I think they operate side by side. And I think when you think about them together, they do make a lot of sense and help you understand how to process what's happening in Washington, D.C. and why it matters to your work and your organization. So that's why we're calling today A Tale of Two Politics. It is a story that is very bifurcated. There has been a lot of wonderful news out of Washington, D.C. this year that we're going to talk about. There have also been some very challenging headwinds. Now, unlike A Tale of Two Cities, all of this is taking place side by side in Washington, D.C., but I guess if you needed a second location for this, you could probably do it at the Canadian border. But it is a story of headwinds that are challenging us going forward and give us pause as we think about planning for 2026 and all of the wonderful events that you and your colleagues will be working on. And all of what happens in Washington, D.C., we like to sort through something that at ECA we call the four T's of public policy. These are the four issues that are really driving changes in the industry, both positively and negatively. And if you look at your screen, you can see we have taxes, talent, tariffs, and travel. And there have been a significant amount of developments in these issue areas, all four issue areas this past year. And I want to go through some of them over the next few minutes with all of you. Let's start with the good news story. Let's tell the tale of what's positive here in Washington, D.C. And it is a primarily domestic story. It has really been about domestic policy changes that will help the industry. And it focuses on those top two T's, the taxes and talent. And this is a conversation that started around, I don't know, almost 2 years ago, because Congress was facing tax reform this year. You all may have seen this in the news that there was some tax policy that was passed back in 2017 that if Congress didn't extend by the end of the year, there was going to be a tax hike in all of our paychecks. All of the individual tax cuts of 2017 were set to expire, and we were all going to be set for a pay decrease at the end of the year if Congress didn't act. And if you've seen on television or online, you know that oftentimes Congress doesn't necessarily act until it absolutely has to. And that's why tax reform was so important this year. And inside the Beltway, we were calling it the Super Bowl of tax. This was nearly $4.7 trillion in tax cuts that were due to expire. And it was something that Congress began to look very early last year in 2024, knowing this was coming up, to understand how are we going to pay for this? Are we going to pay for this at all? And where can we see opportunities to raise revenue and otherwise change tax policy to help offset some of these tax cuts that you and I experience? And as we began the year, it was looking like a bit more of a challenging environment in terms of how they were going to pay and where they were looking for resources to be able to pay for these tax cuts. And that dovetailed very tightly with ECA's tax agenda for this year. Every year, ESCA and ECA's other members get together and determine what the priorities for the year ahead are going to be. And for tax policy at the end of last year, it was determined that these four items were going to be our tax reform agenda, what we were looking for out of federal tax reform. And I call your attention in particular to those top three, because those would all be tax increases, ways to help offset the tax cuts that would have impacted some part of the industry, whether that's, an increase in business tax rates that would impact things like spend and attendance at events, things like the treatment of investment income coming into the industry, or the tax treatment of association events, which many of you probably know are tax exempt income. So when an association puts on a trade show, the revenue they take in is not subject to tax. Those were all things that were on the table as the conversations began. And there's also a piece down here at the bottom around 529 savings plan expansion that dovetailed with our workforce agenda. And ECA has been very involved, as of most of you all in your organizations, around trying to bring in the next generation of talent into the industry, those rising leaders like all of you. And what we were really thinking about was how to get the federal government to partner with us in attracting and training our next generation workforce. And so part of that is how do we allow 529 college savings plans to pay for things like license and certifications that many of you need to move ahead, things like the IAE-CEM program, for example. And also, how do we get Pell Grants, which are used extensively throughout the country? I believe this year the Pell Grant budget was around 24 billion with a B dollars to pay for skills training, because we know there's such a skill shortage and such a labor shortage on the show floor and in folks' back rooms and shops, that how do we get more people with the skills that your organizations need to hire and create opportunities for them to have really, really great jobs and careers within this industry, which we all know is such a fantastic place to work. And so this all came to a head on July 4th when a piece of legislation called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed into law. No, I do not know how they name these bills in Washington, D.C. They always have silly names, but this was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and this was Congress's tax reform legislation for 2025. And when you look at what the Big Beautiful Bill Act had and how it balanced up against ECA's tax reform priorities for the year, I'm very happy to report that we went 4 for 4 as an industry. No harmful tax increases on either business profits, on private investment into the industry. Associations and their shows remain tax exempt. And we were able to get the 529 expansion for our future workforce efforts. Actually, it's even better than that. We managed to actually go 5 for 4 on our tax reform priorities, and we were able to get the Pell Grant expansion into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act as well. We were able to do this because we also helped secure $10.5 billion of new investment into the program to help pay for skilled workforce training going forward. So really, this legislation was an absolute home run for the industry. No harmful tax increases and 2 significant investments into our future workforce, which we think was tremendous. And some of the folks, I'm looking at the participant list here on today's webinar, and I know quite a few of you were in Washington, D.C. for ECA's Legislative Action Day, which took place just a month before Congress finished its consideration of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So there are quite a few ESCA members on today's call who were absolutely instrumental in meeting with folks, meeting with members of Congress and their staffs to help push this across the finish line. So an absolutely tremendous opportunity for the industry, which we were very, very happy to see. And this also combines with some other things that we've seen from a positive standpoint in terms of state and local legislation. Many of you may know that there was an effort afoot in California to restrict the use of propane-powered forklifts on show floors starting on January 1st of 2026. We were able to successfully advocate for this to get moved back until at least 2029 in a way that syncs up with many of the net zero plans that your organizations have and some of the pledges that you've signed. So we were able to find something where the policy aims from an environmental perspective and the industry's feasibility was much better synced up. And so this is an important victory. Also, many of your clients and many of the folks, the show organizers and the folks they represent are in a bit of a deregulatory environment in Washington, D.C. right now. The Trump administration has had a very strong focus on deregulation and trying to pare back regulation that allows business to thrive. And so overall, if you look at the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and some of these other aspects of domestic policy around taxes and talent, it tells a good news story for the industry, and it tells a story that I think is going to be foundational to underpinning the growth and expansion of the industry in the US going forward, both in terms of investment coming in, organizations growing their own shows, and the expansion and growth of many of the exhibition service providers represented here on the call today. And so if we looked at it just from that perspective, 2025 has been a very good news story for the industry, and there's been a lot of fantastic work going on that's going to benefit the industry for years to come. But it's the tale of two politics, not one. And the other story is much more challenging. It is a story that is primarily international in scope and kind of stops at the water's edge of the US and begins our challenges around the world. And it's focused on the other two T's of ECA's public policy agenda, the tariffs and travel. And I know these are issues that have been in the headlines for quite some time. And I want to talk a little bit about those and a little bit about how they impact the industry more broadly. And I think any conversation in this area almost has to start with tariffs. This is something that has been top of mind for everyone for the last 6 to 8 months. I believe it was about 6 months ago where we had what President Trump called Liberation Day that introduced the reciprocal tariffs, the new tariff rates on imported goods from other countries that sent the financial markets into quite a state and has brought about a lot of trade-related uncertainty ever since. But to talk about tariffs, I actually have to talk about the 1980s cinematic classic Ferris Bueller's Day Off first. And for those of you who have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off and remember this famous scene where Ben Stein was Ferris Bueller's teacher, looking for him and trying to figure out why he wasn't in class, what you might not remember about that scene is Ben Stein was talking about something and teaching about something that day called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. And for those of you who may not know too much about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, it is some tariffs that Congress enacted after the stock market crash of 1929 that was designed to stave off economic catastrophe and instead wound up driving the United States straight from the stock market crisis into the Great Depression. And millions of jobs were lost, millions of businesses shuttered, people lost their homes nationwide. And from a political perspective, from where I sit in the world, it is particularly interesting that these tariffs ultimately inspired something that Congress very rarely ever does. Congress admitted that they were wrong here, that the tariff policy was terrible, and did something even more rare by Congress's standards. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure they've ever done it since. They actually said, we're unqualified to deal with this, you deal with it. And so from the 1930s all the way through the 1970s, Congress basically delegated all of its authority around tariff policy to the executive branch. So to the president, to the United States Trade Representative, to the Department of Commerce. So if you've looked at tariff situation over the last few months and gone, my goodness, why doesn't somebody step in here? It's because there's nobody to step in. All of this authority sits with the president. And that's why we've seen such uncertainty and such increasing tariff rates. Actually, as we sit here today, we're looking at one of the highest tariff rates since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. The average effective tariff rate of goods coming into America right now is over 16%. Depending on some things that may happen going forward, that number could substantially decrease or increase over the next couple months. And if you look at this map, depending on where you're importing things from around the world, the baseline tariff rate of goods coming into the United States sits anywhere between 10 and 50%. And I prepared these slides before the latest kerfluffle with China over the last few days. And the effective tariff rate of goods coming in from China right now is 115% as we sit here today. And if you look at this screen, here are some numbers that just sort of show quantitatively what we're looking at here. We have essentially added tariffs to nearly $1 trillion of goods coming into this country since early January. About $800 billion of those goods have been tariffed under something called the International Emergency Protection Act. And I bring that up because we're going to talk about it later. So that's an important one we're going to come back to. A little less than half have come from China, a little more than 10% from Canada and Mexico. It's been a little bit of a drag on economic growth. It's been slightly inflationary. But if you look at those numbers down at the bottom of the screen, I'll tell you, just kind of working inside the Beltway and working in the world of politics, these are the numbers that scare me the most. We nearly doubled tariff revenue coming into the Treasury over the last 12 months. And for fiscal year 26, which actually started on October 1st, the federal government begins its fiscal years on October 1st, or at least they're supposed to when they're not shut down. We're going to look at about $300 billion of estimated tariff revenue, barring any significant changes coming into the country. Why is that a problem? Well, when tariff revenue comes in, it just goes straight into the general treasury, which means the president and Congress can spend it. And trust me, they will spend it. And historically, when there's a new source of revenue into the Treasury, it becomes very, very hard to get Congress and the president to stop spending that money and to give that money up and say that money should go back to the importers that it came from, or in the case of individual tax rates, back to the taxpayers. I have some real concerns over the long term that Congress is going to get addicted to this money, and it's going to be very hard to decrease tariffs in the long term, but we'll get more to that later. Over the last few months, we have been playing what inside the Beltway we're calling Deal or No Deal. There have been trade deals struck between the United States and several entities to lower some of those tariff rates, including the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and others. But as we sit here today, 4 of the US's 10 largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, China, and India, have no trade deals right now. And so they are subject to much higher tariffs, which has significantly disrupted the flow of goods into the United States. Now, since January 20th, the White House has really been the focal point for tariff policymaking in the United States. You know, President Trump has posted things on social media that have increased tariffs almost immediately. And so people have really been looking to the White House for what's happening next when it comes to tariff policy. That's actually going to change on November 5th, and the venue is going to switch from the White House to the Supreme Court. And on November 5th, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case called Learning Resources versus Trump. And this case was brought by a toy manufacturer who sued the Trump administration under the grounds that those emergency tariffs we were talking about earlier, that $800 billion of goods that have either baseline or reciprocal or fentanyl related tariffs attached to them, are unconstitutional and that they're illegal for the president and the administration to collect on behalf of the United States of America. This case has been heard twice already, and both times the courts agreed that these tariffs are unconstitutional. And that's why the Supreme Court is ultimately decided to take up this appeal. Why did this toy company and why did the lower courts agree that these tariffs were unconstitutional? Like I said, these were issued under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1974. And if you look at the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1974, there's a funny little thing about it. It doesn't actually mention the word tariff anywhere. It grants the president and his administration some emergency powers, but it doesn't mention tariffs. It doesn't mention other similar words like duties or taxes anywhere in the legislation. So President Trump and his administration have applied a very broad interpretation of this law to apply tariffs on goods coming into the country to the tune of $800 billion, as we mentioned earlier. And both courts have said this is something that has not been delegated to the president. And the Supreme Court has something that they like to call the major questions doctrine that says on matters of major significance, whether it's policy significance or tax significance, that the administration, any administration, can't act unless Congress has specifically delegated those powers to the administration. And so, for these reasons, a lot of observers anticipate that this case, the alerting resources case, might overturn those tariffs from President Trump. The hearing is going to take place on November 5th. Most observers expect that there's going to be a verdict issued sometime in early January. And that's going to create a very unique set of circumstances, particularly if the Supreme Court decides to overturn those tariffs, because there are a couple of very, very interesting questions that sort of come from that. Part of it is, well, if $800 billion of goods have been tariffed, you're probably looking at, that $191 billion of revenue I mentioned earlier, you're probably looking at about $150, $160 billion of that comes from these emergency tariffs. And so do importers receive a refund? Does a booth builder get a refund on some of the aluminum or lumber that it's ordered from overseas? And how would that happen? How would the federal government refund that money? God, that might take years, actually. And the most frequent question I get when you talk about the Supreme Court case is this going to be the end of tariffs? So if these tariffs are unconstitutional, does that mean the end of tariffs? And unfortunately, the answer is, I don't think so. What I'm going to put here on the screen is a quote from Donald Trump that he made at a political event in New Hampshire talking about why he doesn't believe tax increases are the answer to the federal deficit and why tariffs and trading partners should be leveraged to help pay off the debt and the deficit. And this is a quote he made in October of 1987. The view that President Trump holds on tariffs and trade are longstanding. They go back more than 4 decades. And so President Trump, even if the Supreme Court argues or correctly decides that these tariffs are unconstitutional, the president still has a whole variety of tools at his disposal to make tariffs and to increase costs on goods coming into the United States. I've got a couple of them circled up here at the top. These are the most common laws that are used to issue tariffs. And as an example, the one at the top, the Section 232 tariffs, President Trump has already launched, in addition to all the emergency tariffs, has launched 13 investigations on different sectors of the economy under national security grounds to have increased tariffs on certain categories of goods and services. And 4 of those have already been completed, and new tariffs have been issued on things like steel and aluminum, things like lumber and their derivative products, which includes things like furniture, which is very important for the industry. So the president still has a lot of leeway at his disposal, regardless of what the Supreme Court decides when it comes to tariff policy. And so that kind of begs the question of, in that case, well, and so what? What are we talking about? If the president can still issue tariffs, why does this matter to the industry? And I'll give you 2 reasons, and both of them connect to the same idea, which is time. As folks know, as tariffs have been coming in hot and heavy throughout the course of the year, the tariff rate on a particular good might be one thing one day and one thing another day. And that has really caused a lot of chaos. That's caused just almost a bit absence of being able to plan for these challenges. Now, when you look at these particular tariff parts right here, and the most commonly used, like the Section 232s and the Section 301s, these investigations are laid out in statute, in law, about what they look like, and they take a long time. An average 232 investigation takes 9 months between the time when it's launched and when the findings are disclosed and what they ultimately decide to do about that. And that gives folks in the industry some planning time that they haven't had yet. So if there's going to be new tariffs on a particular category of goods or services, let's say a certain electronic component that folks use, you're going to know that something's coming down the pike ahead of time, at least 9, maybe sometimes as long as 12, 18 months, so that you can begin to prepare for that. Whether that's writing language into your contracts to provide your organization with downside protection, whether it's being able to import some of those goods and store them ahead of time so that when the time comes, you have a supply that you're not exactly going back out on the market and paying these increased costs because of the tariffs. You also would have a time, if the Supreme Court ultimately rules that the emergency tariffs are unconstitutional, where there's going to be much more of a lower tariff environment. That 16% we saw earlier is going to decrease significantly. And so that gives organizations the opportunity to import more during these times, to be able to stock ahead, to be able to plan for what's coming, and take advantage of a lower tariff environment in the near term. So lots of potential benefits on the horizon. We don't necessarily get rid of tariffs going forward, but it is something to keep an eye on, and your organization can potentially pounce to be able to benefit from this period of lower tariffs coming right after the Supreme Court case in January. For the latest news on tariffs, I'm just going to put this QR code up there, or you can go to the ECA website at ECA-advocacy.org. We have something called the ECA Tariff Resource Center. And as changes are coming in, as news comes in, we're working with our public policy council. It's a firm in town in DC called Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck, that we're publishing new updates pretty much on pretty much a weekly basis at this point on the latest tariff news that your organization needs to know to be able to stay competitive and to stay ahead of the tariffs. We're going to be updating this going forward and providing you all with the resources that you need to be able to navigate this uncertainty. And so I would encourage you all to take a look at the ECA Tariff Resource Center, and I'll put a link to that in the chat at the end of our session today too. Now to the other T, travel. This is another area where we've seen a lot of developments, a lot of news over the last few months, and we'll start that conversation, I guess, with visas. I think, as people may know, visas have been a real concern for the United States since the start of international travel after COVID back in November of 2021. And why is that? Well, during the pandemic, the US stopped issuing visas. There was, by and large, international travelers were not welcome into the country, and so there wasn't a need to issue visas. But while we weren't issuing visas, we were still taking in applications. And so, people were continuing to apply for a visa even though they weren't being processed. And so lo and behold, November 2021 comes around, and at all the embassies and consulates around the world, there was a backlog of more than 2.7 million visa applications that needed to be worked through. And so you had visa wait times of a year, 2 years, 3 years in some locations, which, thinking about, trade shows, thinking about business events, right? You've got exhibitors who are putting money down 6, 9, 12 months ahead of time. And if they are waiting 3 years for a visa interview, there's no way those customers can come to the United States. And so it was a drag on events, and we've been lobbying pretty vociferously ever since for the State Department to make the investments it needs to do, make the changes it needs to make to drive visa wait times down. And last year, we were successful in making some changes there. Talk about those in a minute. But when we talk about visas, it's important to understand that the industry and Washington, D.C. looks at the issues of visas through very, very different lenses. And we look through it as a business issue, right? We're trying to bring people over. We're trying to bring customers who are going to spend money at events, whether that's on their booths, whether that's on, service contractors and providers, whatever the case may be. This is a business issue for us, right? This is a dollars and cents kind of issue that, the more international customers we have over, the more successful the shows are, and the more successful everybody in that ecosystem becomes. Well, unfortunately, DC looks at it through a very, very different paradigm. And in DC, it's an immigration issue. And if you've turned on the TV at any point, really honestly, in almost the last 20 years, and the word immigration is mentioned, you know that this is an issue where everybody goes to their corners, and it's very, very hard to find bipartisan consensus on some of the changes that need to be made to help bring our international customers over to events here in the US. Now, as I mentioned, there were some positive changes. Last year, ECA helped get the State Department $50 million solely dedicated to working down visa backlogs, and it has made quite a bit of a difference. As we would have sat here on October 21st of last year, there were 92 US embassies and consulates around the world that had visa wait times of 90 days or longer, which was what we think the gold standard is. We think if you apply for a visa, you should get an interview within 3 months. That number today is down to 47, so around half of what it was. Now, from my perspective, that's 47 embassies where the wait times are entirely too long, and so we continue to work on this issue. But there are some challenges that are entering the visa system over the last few months that I think are worth flagging. One of them is in the days following the pandemic, the administration put into place a few waivers to help keep those visa queues from filling up even above the 2.7 billion applications that were already in. So if you had a visa and it expired for a couple of years, but you didn't have a criminal record or any background problems, the embassy could go ahead and reissue that visa to you without going through an interview, which we thought was pretty reasonable. And there were some other forms of interviews where, like academics and people coming to the US temporarily, where those interviews were waived as well. Well, in September, those interview waivers sunsetted. And so now, that, for example, if you've got a visa that is expired for less than a year, you can get that renewed without a visa interview. But if it's longer than 366 days, you have to go back into the interview queue. And as we saw previously, there are still quite a few embassies around the world where that's going to involve a long wait time. And so that kind of depresses people's interest in coming to the United States. In addition, visas are going to get more expensive soon. Right about now, it's around $180 to about $230 to get a visa to come to the United States. That is going to more than double soon because back in July, Congress passed something called a visa integrity fee that is going to add an additional $250 of funds to each visa that will then go to the Department of Homeland Security for increased visa enforcement and things of that nature. Now, this was supposed to go into effect on October 1st, and you might have seen some stories in the news about it going into effect, but it is actually not in effect yet, and I'll tell you a little bit why. Not only has the government shutdown stopped work on this project, but sometimes when Congress passes laws, they don't necessarily cover themselves in glory and do the best job of writing those laws. And this was one of those examples. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Homeland Security has been instructed to collect this $250 fee that then goes into their coffers to fund various forms of enforcement to make sure that people aren't overstaying their visas. Well, the problem is the Department of Homeland Security isn't actually involved in visa processing at all. That's all managed by the Department of State. And so now the State Department has been told that Homeland Security has to collect this fee. Legal analysts have said, no, the State Department cannot collect this fee on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security. And so the Department of Homeland Security is building a brand new visa collection system, and this new IT project that will intersperse with the Department of State's visa processing collection system and have some sort of handshake agreement where you'll pay one fee to the Department of State and you'll pay another fee to the Department of Homeland Security. And if you can think of anything about what a government IT project looks like, it's kind of a bit of a disaster. So thankfully, the good news is this has not taken effect yet, and ECA and other organizations are lobbying pretty hard behind the scenes to limit how broadly applicable this fee is going to be when it ultimately takes effect. Because as you can see here on screen, these are some numbers from our friends at the United States Travel Association. You're looking at about 1 million trips into the US every year potentially being impacted by this new fee. Now, just for context, there were 72.1 million trips, both business and leisure, into the US last year. So you're looking at about 1.5% of all visitors to the US. So this is a pretty sizable amount. And it comes along at the same time as some other changes in the visa and travel system, one of which is a new visa bond pilot program. So quite a few countries around the world When visas are issued, they're issued for a particular period of time, usually anywhere between 30 days and 5 years. But if someone is in the country after their visa expires, there's really no centralized way to track where that person is and to get them to leave the country as they're supposed to at the end of their visa. And so the State Department is implemented this new pilot program that has currently affected three countries right now, the Gambia, Malawi, and Zambia. And it's requiring all new visas issued by these countries to collect a bond of between $5,000 and $15,000. And so people have to put that money down in order to get a visa. And the only way they get that money back is by leaving the United States before their visa is expired and then going back to the embassy or consulate where they got their visa and requesting the money back. Four more countries are going to be added actually over the weekend. Sao Tome and Principe, Tanzania, Mauritania, and Mali, which interestingly, 2 days ago decided in response that they are now asking all US travelers coming to Mali to put down a $10,000 visa. So this pilot program is going to go on through October of next year, only going to impact about 2,000 visas over the course of the year of the pilot program. Interestingly, the State Department was originally planning on doing this back in 2020, before the onset of COVID. It was actually supposed to launch in May of 2020. But we're not able to do that, obviously, because of the pandemic. And so this is now when they're running the pilot program that Congress has authorized them to do. At the same point in time, we've also have some country-specific travel bans that have been reintroduced. If you look at this map, you'll see 19 countries highlighted. The countries that are highlighted in that burgundy color, travel is fully restricted from those nations, and you see down in the lower left-hand corner which countries those are. For an additional 7 countries, travel has been partially limited. That is generally leisure travel. Most business travel is still permitted. But travelers from these 19 countries make up about little less than 0.5% of trips into the US last year, about 350,000 trips out of that 72.1 million trips that I talked about earlier. Now, right after these were issued back in June, another 36 countries were warned by Secretary of State Rubio that there were concerns that the United States had around processing passports and the like. In many of these countries, as a citizen of another country, you can move to that country, invest a certain amount of money, and then become a citizen of that country and then apply for a passport from that particular country. So that has been something that has seen a real rise in use over the last 3 years, particularly from folks from Russia, because travel from Russia is banned by many countries, so they will oftentimes, wealthy citizens from those countries will go to some of the countries you see on the screen and apply, spend some money in that country, become a citizen, and then apply for a passport from those countries as a way by which to evade travel restrictions on folks from their home country. As part of this, these countries were warned that if some corrections to their systems weren't made, penalties could include up to being included on this additional list of 19 countries. So these 36 countries, they all account for about 450,000 trips into the US last year. So about a little more than 0.5%, about 0.6%. And so, taken together, you might sort of say, okay, well, we looked at 1.3% on the Visa bond program and about 1% of trips into the US with these travel bans. What are we really talking about? What we're seeing is a real drip, drip, drip of news coming to business travelers outside the United States that, along with some of the headlines we saw earlier this year around people being denied entry into the US because of certain irregularities with their planned travel, and things like a government shutdown where people don't know if there are going to be enough air traffic controllers to make sure their flight from abroad can land in the US. There's a growing misperception throughout the world that the US is closed for business. Now, we all know that that's not true, but we're beginning to see it show up in some of the international travel data, and I'll give you just a few examples here. You take a look at this chart right here. Inbound arrivals via air are set to decrease about 8% this year compared to last year into the US. And if you look at that light blue chart, you can see where the original projections were and then sort of the new projection based on some of these travel restrictions and the tariffs and some of the broader sentiment. If you look at that light blue line and you trace it all the way out to that dotted line, you'll see that the 2020 or sorry, 2019 levels of international travel into the United States, we're not expected to reach that level of international travel again until 2029. So we've had a decade of lost international travel. And then many of those are business folks who would come in for trade shows, for conferences, conventions, and the like. And so it's been a drag on the growth of the industry. International travel spending into the United States is going to be down more than 3% this year. Now you'll look on this chart and you'll say, okay, well, it's 8% on this chart, it's 3% on this chart. What's the difference? The difference is inflation and increased prices. So, if prices were held constant in 2024 numbers without inflation, you'd be looking at a similar 8% decrease in international travel spending into the United States. And that's significant because the Center for Exhibition Industry Research found that the average international traveler who comes in for a business event, for a trade show, spends about $11,600. The average exhibitor spends more than $36,000 when they come to the US on a show. And that's everything from travel, booth construction, show fees, hotel, you name it. And so that's a significant amount of money that the US is losing out on. And I think ground zero for this is obviously Canada. You've seen a lot in the news about traveler sentiment from Canada coming to the US, and that definitely bears itself out in the data. What you're looking for out on this chart right now, this is a year-over-year decline in car trips over the Canadian border from Canadian citizens coming into the United States. In August, the last month that we have data for, trips year over year were down more than a third, which is a tremendous decrease. If you look at it via air, it's down more than 25% year over year. And so, as one of our largest feeder markets, this is significantly impacting what we're seeing on the show floor in terms of Canadian exhibitors and attendees coming to events. Now, the news isn't all bad. One example of where things have gotten better is if you go to the other side of the border, travel from Mexico is up almost 12% year over year. Not enough in volume to offset the Canadian decreases, but a significant gain in travel coming in from Mexico. If you look at the top 20 inbound markets to the United States, so countries around the world, we definitely see some challenges in places like India and Germany, China, France, and some other countries throughout Europe where international travel is down. But you contrast that with the UK and Japan, Brazil, Italy, Argentina, some other places in South America, and it kind of nets out as pretty flat. It's down about 0.5% through the end of August, which is the last month we have full data for. So nothing catastrophic, but definitely nothing great either. Where I do think is interesting and it's worth, as you're seeing these stories in the news to keep in mind, business travelers, so people entering the country on business visas versus tourist visas, business travel is holding up much better in the short term for people coming to America than leisure traveler. There's almost a 4% difference right there between business travel being slightly up and people coming for tourism being slightly down. So the good news is our stakeholder group abroad is holding up a little better than the broader audience. We just certainly wish that those numbers were stronger. I think the question at this point is, what's the long-term impact going to be? What are we going to see in the long term? And is it going to affect the competitiveness of the US as, just the industry here in the US more broadly? But also, many of you no doubt serve events that rotate around the world. And so they'll come to the US every, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years. There's a real question around what the impact of that's going to be for events that are being hosted in the US going forward. And so that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on. But regardless, I think it's fair to say that we're definitely seeing some headwinds in that regard. So, in summary, to wrap all of this up, it's a tale of two politics. It is a story that's all built around what at ECA we call the 4 T's of policy that are impacting the industry. We have a good news story when it comes to the areas of taxes and talent. We've had some legislation signed into law this year that really makes a significant investment in our workforce and creates a tax regime going forward that's very, very conducive to growth and to investment within the industry and really will help underpin the industry's growth going forward. But at the same time, we're getting a drag from that bad news story, that story of international challenges when it comes to tariffs and travel. And whether it's the increased tariff rates and the uncertainty that that's causing, the increased cost pressure, or the feeling that travelers around the world are getting about coming into the US, we are still seeing quite a bit of headwinds that are dragging what should be a very strong growth environment for us. What does it all mean going forward? It means we're going to have an environment of uncertainty when it comes to policy and its impact on the industry. And that's going to persist into 2026 and beyond because, as I think everybody in this group knows, we really do live in a politics first world. Politics seems to be the lens that we're looking at everything through. And unfortunately, that includes events that are impacting the industry. And so with that, I am going to pause our story right here, but I want to do so at a time where I want to thank Julie and Rachel and Tammy and the entire ESCA team who has been part of ECA from the beginning, who's one of our founding members, and continues to work hard to make sure that all of your voices and all of your concerns are part of ECA's messages up on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. So we'll pause the story there for the moment, but I would love to get, any questions, any feedback in terms of what you all have heard about this tale of two politics, as it were.
Well, thank you so much, Tommy. I think we all learned a lot about politics and travel and tariffs and the four T's and how it's impacting the industry. So if anybody listening has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And we have Tommy here for the next few minutes to answer some of your questions. But I wanted to get it started. And I know you mentioned the current government shutdown a few times during your presentation today. So I just wanted to know what you're hearing on Capitol Hill on how long that government shutdown will last and how that impacts our industry.
The challenge when you do a presentation like this is you always want to close out with good news. You want to have people feeling really good as they leave. And this is one area that the news isn't as good as I very much wish it were. The short answer to that question is not in October. This government shutdown is going to go into November, unfortunately. When it hits, I believe it's November 5th, it's going to become the longest government shutdown in history. And it really does look like we're going to see that. Um, my best guess is they're going to wrap this up. I'm looking at a calendar over here. Sometime the second or third week of November. They need to get this done, obviously, before everybody travels for Thanksgiving, because a travel disaster there could have some pretty disastrous political implications for both parties. But I think it's really going to go into November. There's not a lot of conversations happening behind the scenes in terms of trying
Wow.
to scope out what a deal looks like. And I'll be honest with you, the part that I am the most concerned about is they're talking about a deal to reopen the government. And that's what they call in DC a continuing resolution. So it's not even, that doesn't even fund the government for the fiscal year through September 30th. That just reopens it and gives Congress some more time to finish its work on funding bills. And my best guess is that's going to go into January, February. And so there's a non-0% chance that there might actually be another government shutdown at some point when this government shutdown is done. So this is a rough one, something definitely worth keeping an eye on. But I'm afraid for the time being, I don't see the government shutdown ending before next month.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is crazy to hear that this might be the longest one in history and how
Yeah,
it
it's a bad news story.
It is. Well, maybe this will be a little bit of a good news story to end on. We do have a question in the chat. Somebody has asked that they have heard there might be another tax reform bill coming next year.
Mm.
Is that likely?
There have been a lot of rumors on Capitol Hill about wanting to do another tax reform bill. And that could be good or bad for the industry in terms of, we've got these hard-won benefits that we got earlier this year. We obviously wouldn't want to see them clawed back, but I'm sure there are other opportunities to make tweaks to the tax code that could potentially be advantageous to the industry going forward. The short answer to your question is I would put that at about a 1% chance or less. As I mentioned earlier, and particularly when it came to this first tax reform bill, Congress doesn't act unless it has to. And
Mhm.
so if it didn't pass tax reform legislation this year, all of our paychecks were going to look a little lighter at the beginning of 2026. And that's bad politics for everybody. So that was sort of what we call in DC, we call it the cliff, right? You can walk all the way up to the end of the cliff, but you can't fall over the cliff because then disastrous things happen. And so that was a cliff that forced Congress to act. There's not really a cliff that is going to change anything as it pertains to Congress having to do something before a certain deadline. There are really no deadlines that force it to act. And as we've seen with this government shutdown, even when Congress does have deadlines like September 30th to act, they don't always do it. So I think the political dynamics for another tax reform bill are pretty limited for this year, but we are keeping an ear out for it. We are continuing to have conversations with the tax writing committees so that if they do something around that, we'll be ready and prepared to advocate on behalf of the industry.
So that is a lot of great information, Tommy. We have another question in the chat. How do you see the upcoming election cycle and political
Mm.
shifts in federal leadership influencing advocacy priorities for the business events industry?
So that's a very, very interesting question. And I have maybe a little bit of a counterintuitive answer to it, which is I don't know that it impacts very much. And here's why I say that. That one big, beautiful bill we talked about earlier, that
Hmm.
was really, if you look at the agenda that President Trump ran on back in 2024, that was really the vast majority of his agenda that involves Congress. So that's why you've seen a lot of executive orders and you've seen a lot of these executive actions, some of which are being challenged in the courts that are, President Trump taking policies that are currently in effect and sort of testing the limits of them without necessarily needing to go to Congress for all the reasons I just mentioned, right? Congress is not terribly functional and doesn't always do a great job around doing that. So President Trump kind of used this as a shortcut to get around it. So I think about the 2026 midterm elections, and there's a possibility that the Democrats will control either or both houses of Congress, probably just one. And that's just going to mean more investigations. That's going to mean more sort of mudslinging between the two parties. And that creates an environment that's very, very tough to pass new legislation. So I think we're just going to see a continuation of some of the stalemate we already see. And particularly, if you look at Congress now, the margins are very, very thin. And
Hmm.
so I think that would just almost grind Congress to even more of a halt than it's already at, if you can even imagine such a thing. And it's going to fall down to the president to continue to be making the vast majority of policy decisions. And so obviously for the ones that are good for the industry, we will support those. And obviously for the ones that are challenging to the industry, like we talked about around tariffs or travel, we're going to be there to advocate against those policies. So I unfortunately don't know that it changes all that much, but it remains to be seen. But that is something definitely we are keeping an eye on.
Yeah. So on that notes, what can people watching this webinar now, what can they do to advocate for the business events industry?
So I'm going to throw some slides back on the screen for just a second. Don't worry, it's not like 100 slides like I just had. It's much shorter than that. But I want to show you a couple of things that ECA has that's available to everybody on this webinar today and everybody throughout the industry. One of them is, as I mentioned, the developments in this space are coming pretty fast and furious. And every other Friday, ECA puts out its public policy update newsletter. For
Mhm.
those of you who read anything from Axios, we partner with Axios to do our newsletter, so it kind of looks the same way. Usually very quick hitting 4 items, takes about 2 minutes to read, just with the latest public policy news that you all and your organization should know about. And so if you scan that QR code or you go to our website at ECAadvocacy.com, yeah, click on newsletter. You'll be able to register for that newsletter. I definitely recommend it because things are coming. The developments I don't think they're going to slow down anytime soon. So I highly recommend checking that out. On the advocacy front, ECA has something that if you scan this QR code or you go to our website at ECAadvocacy.com, it's called the ECA Advocacy Network. And it's
Mhm.
essentially a place where you can go, anybody can go throughout the industry, and we have a whole bunch of different programs that you can get involved politically and policy-wise and raise your voice. You can email your member of Congress about issues that matter to you, maybe some of the ones you heard about before. We've got some sample letters up there you can send them. We've got something called a social influencer program where, we'll give you content to post on social media and tag your policymakers, whether state, local, federal, and talk to them about the issues that matter to you because so much of the political conversation really is driven online these days. We have something where we'll help you write an op-ed or a letter to the editor and get placed in your local newspaper or media outlet. And we also have something, it's really my favorite program that we have. It's called the Show Floor Program. And
Mhm.
what it does is we'll show you how to bring a politician, whether that's a member of Congress, a mayor, a governor, a city council member, to events that you're working on. So you can let them see just exactly what the work that you're doing, how it contributes to your community, and to, as a constituent and a voter of theirs, why it should matter to them. And so one of the things that we have found is when you bring an elected official to move in for a trade show, right? They've been to trade shows, they've been to conferences, they've been to hundreds of them, but they've
Hmm.
never been to move in and they've never seen all the folks like you working on the show floor to make that magic happen. They've never seen all the booth builders. They've never seen all the caterers running around and all that chaos. And it helps them connect that, these events aren't just traveling circuses, right? They involve people in their community, small businesses in their community that are absolutely vital. And so when they're voting or they're introducing legislation or they're making decisions, we want to make sure that us as an industry, that we're top of mind to them. And that's just really a great way to do it. So if you visit that website, scan that QR code, you can access any of those different programs that can get you involved wherever you are nationwide. And then, of course, we have our Legislative Action Day that we do every year. Next year, we're going to have it take place on May 28th. It's the Thursday after Memorial Day weekend. And if you take a look at some of the faces on the screen, you're going to see a lot of ESCA members. I know Rachel and Julie and Tammy, you were all part of it last year, which we very much appreciate. And we, of course, invite anybody who's watching this to please come and join us and get linked up on this and make sure your voice is heard, because if not now, when?
Definitely. And it was truly an amazing experience. And I would recommend everybody go and participate in Legislative Action Day. And speaking of, we do have a question in the chat asking for rising leaders who want to be a part of the advocacy conversation, but feel unsure where to start. What would be your advice for how they start that conversation? Would it be attending Legislative Action Day, or is there another smaller step that they can start their advocacy journey?
The answer to this question is easy. There's no wrong door. However you choose to get involved, however you choose to bring your voice to the conversation, whether that's your voice as an individual or on behalf of your organization, it's going to make an impact. And so whichever way, any of those programs I just described, if you've got 5 minutes between the end of this webinar and your next meeting and you hop on there and you send a pre-written message to your member of Congress, that's impactful. If you're active online and you share social media content, that's impactful. Anything you do to get involved is a great first step. And ECA is here to support you every step of the way. We would love everybody watching this to come to Washington, D.C. for Legislative Action Day, but I know that's not possible. But it's a busy time of year for the industry. Not everybody can just, pack up and travel to D.C. We understand that. If you can, please join us. We'll make sure it's a great experience for you. We will ease your way into it however we can. But that's what ECA is here for, regardless of how you get involved. So for all the rising leaders in the industry, we want your voice. We need your voice. And however you choose to take that first step, ECA is going to be here to support you every step of the way.
Thank you so much, Tommy. I know you've been a very big help to me as I start my Rising Leaders journey and allowing me to attend Legislative Action Day last year. It was really inspiring to see just the industry come together and advocate on Federal Hill. So thank you for putting up that opportunity for everyone. And with that, we are at time, and I want to be cognizant of everybody joining us today. But I did want to let you know this session has been recorded and will be distributed in our ESCA newsletter tomorrow, and it will also be shared on our website. We do have a one-sheeter with all the resources and information that Tommy shared today that will be included in that report back tool after this webinar. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Tommy or to myself, and we would be happy to showcase and share more ways that you can get involved and advocate for our industry. So, Tommy, thank you so much for joining and participating in our second ever ESCA Rising Leaders webinar.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to all of you who've watched this. And if you haven't been involved in advocacy before, it's just like Rachel mentioned. Now's the time. We'd love to have you on behalf of ESCA, on behalf of the industry. Thank you for getting involved.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.